Hi again, this is Jeff, your ProtoPie expert answering your ProtoPie questions. Today's question comes from Cristiano. He asks, I am struggling making an accordion. Can you guys help me? Yeah, sure, Cristiano, we can help. This is going to be using some of ProtoPie's more advanced features. We're going to be using components, we're going to be using variables, and we're going to be using send and receive. All right, let's just jump right in. In my pie here, I have the beginnings of a single element of my accordion. As you can imagine, a single element will look something like this, and when I tap it, it will expand to show its body text underneath, and if I tap it again, it will contract to hide that text. And there will be a stack of about 5 items of these that will move up and down in accordance with items that expand and contract. Now, since I'm going to have 5 items that all do the same thing, what I want to do is I want to use a component. This means I can create it once, add all my logic into that component, and then duplicate it as many times as I need. So let's do that. Let's start by making this a component. I'm going to select all the items in my stack. I'm going to click the bottom one, hold down Shift, click the top one. They all get selected. Right click, create component. Okay, ProtoPie has made this into a component, and in fact, this is a copy of the master here. I know it's a component because the label is turned green, and I have the lightning bolt icon beside it. The name is a little bit cryptic. It's called a component 1.1. What ProtoPie has done here is it's made a master component called component 1, and we can see that by expanding the components drawer. That's this icon with the little tiny lightning bolt icon. And you can see my master is called component 1. And since this is my first copy, it tacked on the number 1 to it. Let's make these names a bit more meaningful. I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to call this Accordion Element. And this being my first copy, I could call this Accordion Element 1, but that's a lot to type. I'm just going to call this Item 1. You can name your copies anything you like, so just choose something that's meaningful to you. Now let's go in and make some changes to the master. Any change I make to a master will ripple down into all the copies we have. And since we're going to have 5 copies of these, I want all those changes to ripple into all 5 of these. So to edit the master, you need to have the components drawer open. And once again, that's this icon here that looks like 2 books with a little lightning bolt beside it. And choose the master component, double click it to edit it. So here I am in my master. The first thing I'd like to do is I want to add the expand and contract logic. If I look at all of the layers in here, I've got the body text layered above the base. And a convenient thing that ProtoPie offers is I can turn this base item into a mask. And what a mask does, if I right click and I say use as mask, what a mask does is it only shows the items above it that are within the constraints of that shape. And if I change the size of the shape, you're going to see it starts to reveal other things above it. So this is essentially how our accordion is going to work. When it expands, it's going to scale this shape downwards to reveal the body text, and when it contracts, it's going to scale it back to hide that body text. Let's add that. I'm going to add a tap trigger to the base shape. Add trigger, tap, base is already selected on my stage, so it's already selected here. And I need to make a decision. I only want to expand it if it's currently contracted, and conversely contract it if it's expanded. And we're going to use the size, the height of the base shape to determine if it's expanded or contracted. So let's add a condition. And I want the height property of the base shape. If it equals 60, which is our base size, then our item is contracted. So we want to expand. So condition height equals 60, expand. And let's do that. We're going to scale the base. Now, what size do we scale it to? Well, I want to scale it to 60 plus the height of body text plus a little bit of padding. We'll use 16 pixels for that. So in our scale, we need to use a formula because we want to do a little bit of math. I'm only adjusting the height, so I'm going to leave the width alone. I'm going to create a formula, and I want to start with 60 plus, and I want the height of the body text. Now, I could plug in its height on the stage here of 100 pixels, but instead I'm going to do it in a bit of a smarter way, and this is going to help us a little bit later on. So I want to scale to a height of 60 plus, and I'm going to use the height property of the body text element. So I chose body text by hitting the plus here. Then I press dot on my keyboard, which will give me all the properties, and I want to choose the height property. And then I want to add a little bit of padding underneath it. So let's add 16 pixels. Okay, this should now expand when I tap it. Let's preview this. Bring this guy over here. Okay, I'm clicking on it and it's not expanding. Why is that? Well, if you can see here, we have the tap event on our base item, but there's items layered above. And in particular, this title and the chevron, they cover most of it. And the title and the chevron are not allowing that tap event to pass through. So we need to change the configuration of the items above the base shape. And we can just do that over here, make lower layers touchable. So I'm going to choose that, and I'm going to do that for title. And I'm going to do it for body text as well. Okay, great. Now, if I preview this, it should expand. And there we go, our expansion is working. Let's add in the logic to now contract. And it's going to do the same thing. I'm going to use a condition. And if I want to look at the height property of the base shape. If the height of the base shape is greater than 60, then we want to contract. So let's now scale the base shape to, and we'll just go back to our base size of 60 pixels. Let's rename this. Height is greater than 60, contract. Okay, we should be able to expand and contract. There we go, that's working. Let's add a little bit of panache to this. Our chevron icon is pointing downwards to indicate that it can be expanded. Let's have it flip around to indicate that it can be contracted. So in our expand, let's add a rotate response, and I want it on the chevron icon, and let's rotate it by 180 degrees. Okay, let's say if I preview this, good, it rotates 180 degrees. Now, in your Pi, if it's rotating around, it looks like from the top corner, it's because you have the origin set at a different point as mine. So if we take a look at chevron, my origin is set into the center. By default, ProtoPie will put the origin in the top left corner. So if yours looks like this, where it kind of swings around a little bit, change the origins to be in the center of the shape. So that way now, when it expands, it rotates around its center. Okay, we need to add the logic to put it back to the way it was when it contracts. And I'm just going to do that by resetting the chevron under my contract. So reset, chevron. Let's preview this. It expands, the chevron is now pointing upwards, and if I click it again, it's now pointing downwards. Okay, so our expand and contract is working. Let's go back to our main scene, and now let's make the copies of our component here. And I just want to duplicate this 4 more times, and I'm going to use the Command D or Control D command on my keyboard to do that. So I'm going to make one copy, and you're going to see when I do that, it just pops it over top, but I do have another one in my stack. What I want to do is I want to put it underneath, and I want exactly 10 pixels under here. But you'll notice it's not snapping to the bottom on here. It's actually going to snap way down here. And the reason for that is our component is sized to be not only the base shape of the collapsed size of the accordion element, but also the body text underneath, which is now hidden. We don't have to leave it like this. We can actually change the size of our component. So what I'm going to do, let me remove this guy for now. We'll go back into our master, and if you click on the very top item in your layer stack here, that is the component instance itself. You can change its size, and I'd like to change its size to 60 to match my contracted size. Now if I go back into my scene, and let's make a copy of this, so Command D or Control D on Windows, and if I drag this down, I can snap it right to the bottom. So now that is flush with the bottom. Let's add a little bit of a space on there. I'm going to hold down Shift and press the arrow key downwards. That will add 10 pixels underneath. And let's make 3 more. So 3, 4, 5. And you're going to see it made 3 more copies. They're stacked on top of each other. So let's take the third one, drag you downwards, shift down to add 10 pixels, the fourth one, shift down to add 10 pixels, and the fifth one, same thing. Okay, now we have the beginnings of our accordion. If I preview this, my expand and contract works, but none of the items underneath are moving to accommodate for it. The approach that I'm going to take is when an item expands, it's going to send a message to the scene to say, hey, I'm expanding, anything below me, move downwards. And similarly, when it contracts, it's going to do the same thing. Hey, I'm contracting, anything below me, move upwards. Let's do that. We're going to go into the accordion here. And when we expand downwards, we're going to send a message to the scene. So we're going to add a send response into our expand logic here. and we're going to say send, and I want to send it to the current scene. I want to send to the current scene because I want everything listening to the current scene, which will be all of our component copies, to receive it. So send to the current scene. The message is expanding. Now, right now, there's no way to tell which one is expanding. All 5 of these are identical. There's nothing to differentiate one from the other. So let's set up something that can give a unique identifier to it. I'm going to create a variable. So in your variables panel, bottom left, I'll click it once to expand it, press on plus. I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call this ID. And the most important part here is I need to make this overridable. And what this means is that each copy of my component can have a different value. And if I go back into my scene, when I click the first one, you're going to see I have overrides over here. ID is available for me to change it to whatever I want. And I'm going to change this to 1 for the first one. And this one will be 2. This one will be 3. This one will be 4. And this one will be 5. Essentially what this means is that each copy of this component has a different value for the variable ID. And we can use this to identify which one it is. And I've set these sequential on purpose. So the third one has the ID 3, which means if 3 is expanding, I want 4 and 5 to move downwards, but I want 1 and 2 and 3 to stay put. And if 2 is contracting, for example, I want 3, 4, and 5 to move upwards, and the one above it to stay put. Let's go back into our master, and now let's add in some logic to receive that. So we did a send here, expanding, and let's rename this to say send expanding. Let's receive that expanding command. Receive from current scene, expanding. In our send, we need to send the value of which one is expanding. So we're going to say send value together, and I'm going to send the value of ID. And again, this will be different for each copy because we made it differently in our scene. I'm going to send ID. And in my receive, I'm going to receive ID, and I have to assign it to a variable. We don't have one to assign it to. I don't want it to assign it to ID because I never want this to change. I want the third one to always be 3, for example. So I'm going to make a new variable to keep track of which one is expanding. So let's make a variable here. We'll call this item expanding. And I'm going to assign the value that's sent along with the send. I'm going to assign it to that variable, item expanding. There we go. And we're going to call this receive expanding. Now I'd like to do something. I only want this copy of the accordion element to move downwards if its ID is greater than the one that's expanding. So let's make a condition. If ID, and remember that's the ID of that specific copy, if it's greater than item expanding, then we're going to have it move downwards. Let's do a move response, and the layer I want is I'm going to choose the top level one because I'm going to move the whole component instance. Component element. Now, where do I want it to move to? I don't know how far to move it because I don't know how much the one above me has expanded. In my expand, I'm going to use another send, and I'm going to send the distance that it expanded. Send to the current scene, and I'm going to call this expand distance. And let's rename this as well. Expand distance. And like we passed along the ID of the one expanding, I want to pass along the distance that it expanded. Now in my scale, I did some math here, and the difference between its base size of 60 and what it ended up as is just the body text plus our padding, the height of the body text plus the padding. So let's send that along. Send the value together. I'm going to use a formula for this. Choose the body text and dot height plus 16. That's how far the item below has to move to accommodate for the expansion. Okay, and in my move, or in my move here, I need to tell it to move that much, but I haven't received that expand distance, so I need another receive here. I'm going to add a trigger. This will be receive from the current scene, and this one will be expand distance. And much the same way we assigned the ID of the one expanding into a variable, we have to assign the distance to a variable as well. Again, that variable doesn't exist, so let's create that. And we'll call this expand distance. And we're going to assign to expand distance right here. Now this receive is not going to do anything else. All that's doing is receiving that value and assigning it to a variable. All of our logic will be here. Because we sent these two messages simultaneously, they are received simultaneously. So the item that's expanding and the expand distance are received at the same time and are therefore both available in our logic here. So we only have to put our logic into one of these receives. It doesn't matter which one, but since we've already started under the expanding one, we're going to do it all here. So we want to move the ones that are below downwards the same amount of the expand distance. We don't know where they're starting from because each of them has a different position in the scene. So instead of using move to, we're going to use move by. And that will just move it an amount relative to whatever its current position happens to be. So we're going to move it, and we're going to move it in the Y direction. And I'm going to move it by expand distance. Okay, we'll say OK to that. OK, let's go back to our scene. If this worked, then if we expand one of them, the ones below should move and the ones above should not. Okay, that worked. Before we move on, I want to take a minute just to explain what's going on here because this can get a little bit confusing. Why do I have the send and the receive in the same component? Now remember that I'm sending to the scene and I am listening for that message on the scene. That means that every single copy, let's go back to the scene, every single copy will receive that message, including the one that sent it. So if we preview this, and let's say it's number 2 that expands. Number 2 expands, it sends the message to the scene expanding along with the ID. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 all receive that message. And this is why I've sent the ID along with it, because the ones that need to move down need to make sure that they're below the one that it has expanded. And this is why I've given them IDs sequentially. So 1 gets the ID 1, 2 gets the ID 2, etc. All of the items that need to move have IDs higher than the one that sent it. So if number 2 sent the expanding message, number 3, 4, and 5 need to move because they have higher IDs than the one that sent it. In the receive here, it's doing a check. It wants to make sure that, okay, is my ID greater than the ID of the one expanding? If so, move down. If not, don't do anything. I hope that makes it a bit clearer as to what's going on. Now we need to do the same thing for contraction. So if I click it again, I'm going to send a contract message to the scene and a contract distance, and the ones below shall move upwards. Let's go back into our master and do that. Much the same way that I had to have a variable for the item that's expanding and the expand distance, I need variables to capture item contracting and the contract distance. So let's add another variable. We'll call this item contracting. And another variable, and we'll call this contract distance. We need to send those messages. So when we're contracting, we're going to send a message to the current scene called contracting. And let's send the ID along with it so we know which one is contracting. ID. Oops. ID. We'll hit OK. Send contracting. And we're going to send the contract distance. So send. The message will be contract distance. And much the same way as we sent a little bit of math, we're going to copy this and send that along with it. Okay, send contract distance. And now we have to receive those. So I'm going to receive from the current scene the contracting message. I will assign that to item contracting. And I need to receive the contract distance from the current scene. Contract distance, assign it to a variable, contract distance. All right, now let's add some logic into our contracting receive here. And again, I need to make a decision. If the ID of the current copy is greater than item contracting. Oh, I misspelled that. Let's fix that. It should be item contracting. And when you rename a variable, then you also have to fix any places that use it as well. So we're going to change this to item contracting, and our condition is based on item contracting. So if the ID of the current copy is greater than the item contracting, then I want to move it upwards. So let's go move. And again, I'm going to choose the very top level container of the component copy itself. And again, I want move by. This time I want to move it upwards, so I need a negative number. So we're going to do just a really simple formula, 0 minus contract distance. And I will choose contract distance from my drop-down here. And now it's going to move it upwards. Let's take a look at this. We'll go back to our scene and preview this. So if I can expand the first one and I click it again, there we go. So I have expand and I have contract. And if I move ones below, they should all respond accordingly. And that's working. Our basic accordion is working exactly the way we would like. Now we can customize, and the one nice thing about using components is things are still customizable. So I can change the title of each of these, and I can change the body text of each of these. And the titles are easy to change because I can just double click them, and I can call this, say, item 1. And maybe I want to change this one. We'll change this to item 2. And I'll just do the first two just for demonstration purposes. I can also modify the body text. Now we can't see it, so there's nothing for me to double click on. So in order to get to the body text underneath, you can expand each of the items in your layers palette over here. So if I wanted to change the body text of my first one, for example, you can click it in the layers palette over here and then press the return or enter key on your keyboard and you'll get the text. And what I'm going to do is I want to make this one shorter. So I'm just going to remove the lorem ipsum body text here. I'm going to change this so it's just body text goes here. And let's do the same thing in the second one. Let's add a little bit of text, make this one longer. More text here. Okay, now let's preview this. If I click on the first one, you're going to see I've got body text goes here and my titles are customized. If I click on the second one, I'm not seeing the extra text. So a couple of things are going on here. This one is expanding too much. I only have one line of text. I don't need it to expand this whole blank space extra here. This one has more text than fits in the text box. I need it to expand more. How do we do that? It's actually a fairly simple change. If we go back into our master, and we're going to change the property of our body text to be automatically resizing. And if we take a look down in our properties panel here, you have text resize. And right now it's set to, and if I just let this hover, a fixed size, which means it never changes. But you have an option to resize either vertically or horizontally. So I'm going to change it to auto height. And if I do that, that will make the text box change and accommodate whatever text is in there. Now if we go back to our scene and I preview this, if I expand the first one, it only expands a little bit. And if I expand the second one, you're going to see now I have the extra text, and the third one just has the regular body text that we had before. So that's working. And the reason why that is working that way is, remember when I said when we send the expand distance, we used this formula. As opposed to just putting in the explicit value of 100 pixels, we actually had it measure the height of the body text element here. So this will change depending on how much text is in that box. So this made it a bit smarter for us, and it set us up for being able to accommodate different heights in our accordion. Let's go back to our main scene. So if I'm previewing this, if I expand the first one and I expand the second one, What I'd like to happen is if I expand a second one, I want that first one to contract. So I only ever want one expanded by default. So let's say I have the third one done. If I click the first one, I want the first one to expand and I want the third one to contract. Let's set that up. Back in my master copy of the component here, when I receive the expand message here, what I want to do is an evaluation. If this specific copy, so we're going to say if I am not the one that's expanding and I'm currently expanded, I want to contract. So let's add another condition to when we receive that expanding message. So in our condition, I want to say when the ID of this current copy is not equal to the item expanding. And this is a compound condition, so I need to add a second item here, and I can do that by hitting the plus here. And the body text, its height property, if it's greater than 60, or essentially if it's expanded, then I want to now contract. Sorry, not the body text. We want the base. If the height property of the base element is greater than 60, then I also want this item to contract. And I can copy all of my contract logic right from here. So I'm going to hold down Shift, click the fourth one, Command C or Control C on Windows, and put it under this condition. Now our logic's gotten a bit complicated here, and what we can do is we can rename some things here. So condition ID is greater than item expanding. Condition ID does not equal, and this is a programming way to say is not equal, or you can write not equal to item expanding and expanded. Then I want to contract. Let's go back to our main scene. This should now be fully working. So let's say I expand number 1. If I click on number 2, what I expect to happen is number 2 will expand, number 1 will contract, and all of the ones underneath will adjust accordingly. Okay, that is working. And there you go. Easy as pie. This is a working accordion. If you run into a snag with one of your pies and you'd like to ask us for help, just check out the link in the description below. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video, and as always, thank you for watching.